That's what they call me in whispers, as if my inability to rest is some eccentric quirk rather than the inevitable result of chasing shadows through the long corridors of time. Tonight my desk is cluttered with half-burned candles, crumbling archaeological reports, and sketches of creatures that walk the earth long before our languages could name them. Outside, the wind presses against my window like a restless animal, and perhaps it is fitting, because tonight's subject is the animal that walked into our hearts before any other, the wolf who became the dog. It is an origin story so old that neither party remembered the first agreement. No signature sealed it, no council ratified it. It was not a treaty drawn between species, but a slow dance across millennia, where one step of trust from one side was met with a cautious step from the other. 30,000 years ago, the Earth was colder, darker, more dangerous. The ice sheets had teeth. Winter did not politely ask for permission before settling in. In that world, survival meant calculation, and sometimes unlikely alliances. Imagine the Paleolithic night. A moon cold as bone, the sky crisp with starlight, and somewhere at the ragged edge of a human camp, a pair of eyes glowing like embers. They belonged not to prey, but to predator. A wolf, lean and desperate enough to linger within the scent of smoke. The humans, wrapped in furs stitched with sinew, kept to their firelight. The wolf kept to the dark. Each understood instinctively that this was dangerous territory, and yet neither moved away. Archaeologists, working in caves from Siberia to Western Europe, have unearthed clues from this early courtship. Teeth smaller than those of wild wolves. Skulls subtly reshaped, shorter snouts, broader foreheads. These are not yet the modern dog, but they are no longer the unyielding wolf. They are something in between, what some scientists call proto-dogs, and others, more poetically, the shadows that stayed. The fossils whisper of an ancient experiment, one that neither species planned. Here is the great misconception, that we tamed them. The truth, as the evidence now suggests, is far stranger. They tamed themselves. The wolves bold enough to scavenge at the edges of human encampments found an easier life than those who stalked elk and bison across frozen plains. Their wild kin risked injury in every hunt. The camp wolves risked only a thrown stone or a shouted warning. Over generations, the wolves who tolerated humans began to differ from those who did not. Fear dulled, aggression softened, and so began the slow spiral of self-domestication. But to say the wolves changed alone would be another error. Humans changed too. We learned to read their eyes, their tails, the flick of their ears in the half-light. Our hunting strategies shifted, our nights grew safer, our children slept beneath watchful sentinels who neither demanded nor expected a share in the kill, though they always got one. But this was not a one-way street. It was an evolutionary braid. I'd like to picture the first burial, the earliest proof we have that a dog had crossed from alley to family. 14,000 years ago, at Bon Castle, a young dog was laid to rest beside two humans. The care in its burial is unmistakable. The skeleton shows signs of illness, yet it lived long enough to heal, which means someone tended it. Someone fed it when it could not hunt. Someone, somewhere in that cold and fragile world, decided that the life of this animal mattered beyond its utility. And that, perhaps, is the moment the story shifts from survival to love. From that point onward, the trail grows richer. DNA studies peel back time to reveal that the divergence between wolves and dogs began long before Bon Castle, perhaps 30 or even 40,000 years ago. Somewhere in the late Pleistocene, two branches of a shared ancestor split, one remaining the fierce and wary wolf, the other beginning a long descent into something new. And though that split is now written in their genes, it began in the smallest of decisions, a wolf choosing not to flee, a human choosing not to strike. The transformation was not merely physical. Over time, the animals that would become dogs developed an almost eerie ability to interpret human gestures. Point, and they follow your finger. Look, and they look too. Wolves, even tame ones, do not do this naturally. It is not instinctive for them to read another species so closely. This suggests that our ancestors didn't just alter their shapes, they altered their minds. Yet to focus only on what they became is to miss what we became. Living with dogs may have shaped human evolution as much as the reverse. Studies suggest that cooperation with animals could have reinforced our own social cohesion. The skills needed to manage, train, and interpret dogs may have honed our communication, empathy, and even our emotional intelligence. The domestication of dogs is, in that light, the domestication of humans too. And so the sleepless historian sees it, not as a story of conquest, but of convergence. The wolf gave up some of its freedom, the human gave up some of its solitude. Together, they forged a relationship that has lasted longer than any other interspecies bond in history. Even now, the dogs who sleep at the foot of our beds are the living echoes of those campfire shadows, the descendants of the ones who stayed. The wind outside shifts. Somewhere beyond the city, a dog barks, low, deliberate, as if answering an ancient call. I set down my pen. In my mind, I am already thousands of years away, in a world lit by fire and moonlight, where eyes gleam at the edge of the dark and two species wait to see who will move first. The night air of the late Pleistocene was not silent. It breathed in the form of forests sighing under frost, in the groaning of ice far to the north, in the murmuring of streams that dared not fully freeze. And over it all, the layered chorus of predators and prey. The human ear, far sharper then than it is now, could separate them instantly. The distant trumpeting of mammoths, the click of reindeer hooves against stone, the yipping of foxes in search of a mate. But among these sounds there was one that was neither purely wild nor purely safe, the low, rolling howl of a wolf threading through the night like smoke through a still room. For most of our shared history, that sound had been a warning. Wolves were competition. They hunted the same game. They shadowed human groups, not out of loyalty, but out of hunger. They were dangerous in their hunger, and humans were dangerous in theirs. The first meetings were likely brief and bloody. A thrown spear, a slashed flank. The retreat of one into the darkness. But nature, ever practical, had ways of bending old hostilities into new arrangements. The conditions of 30,000 to 15,000 BCE were the crucible for this transformation. Earth's climate, in the grip of the last glacial maximum, shaped every choice for both species. Winters could last most of the year. Herds migrated along narrow corridors of grassland, forcing predators into tense proximity. And human camps, huddled under mammoth hide tents or sheltered in limestone caves, became predictable sources of two things wolves needed: warmth and waste. To modern minds, the idea of a wolf approaching a human campfire sounds reckless, but hunger erodes boundaries. Picture the scavenger's advantage. Near the camp, discarded bones still slick with marrow, scraps of cooked meat easier to chew than frozen hides, the warmth of fire radiating outward. The wolves bold enough to test this strange opportunity survived longer, bred more and passed on their boldness. In the language of evolution, this was a winning strategy. And on the human side, a strange thing began to happen. The presence of wolves at the fringes of camp may have acted as a natural alarm system. Their senses, honed by countless generations in the wild, detected danger, other predators, approaching strangers, before the human senses could. The wolves that didn't attack were tolerated, perhaps even unconsciously relied upon. Over time, the line between tolerated scavenger and trusted ally blurred. The archaeological record preserves snapshots of this slow dance. In the Altai Mountains of Siberia, a 33,000-year-old skull bears traits halfway between wolf and dog: a shorter muzzle, smaller teeth. In Belgium's Goyet Cave, another partial skull of similar age suggests an early divergence from true wolves. These creatures were not yet curled at our feet, but their evolutionary path was bending toward us. What's remarkable is that these changes were not directed by human intent. Not yet. The shaping force was mutual benefit. The wolves adapted to human tolerance. Humans adapted to their presence. In this way, domestication began as a passive process. It was only later, perhaps much later, that we began to actively select for traits we liked. Gentleness, trainability, a certain look in the eyes. And this mutual adaptation didn't happen overnight. For thousands of years, the relationship must have been one of cautious cohabitation. A wolf could just as easily turn hostile as remain near the fire. Likewise, a hungry human might kill a wolf that overstepped its welcome. But slowly the generations of friendlier wolves grew. The ones with more rounded heads, less intimidating teeth, and calmer dispositions survived in the human sphere. And as they did, they began to diverge, not just physically, but behaviourally. Behaviour is the invisible architecture of evolution. The wolves that lingered at the edges of camp learned, generation after generation, which humans to avoid, how to read the subtle signals of our kind. A dropped shoulder, a lowered spear, these meant safety. A raised voice, a sudden movement, danger. Humans in turn learned their language. The difference between a territorial growl and a warning to the group, the meaning of ears pricked toward the tree line. Without knowing it, both species were becoming bilingual in a language older than words. And perhaps most crucially, they began to hunt together. At first, it may have been nothing more than parallel pursuit. Wolves driving game in one direction, humans taking advantage. But over time, the proximity bred coordination. Wolves, with their endurance and speed, could flush prey from hiding. Humans, with their weapons and strategies, could finish the kill. The spoils were shared, not in equal measure, but enough to reinforce the bond. The genetic clock tells its own version of this story. Studies of ancient DNA suggest that the lineage leading to modern dogs split from the lineage of modern wolves somewhere between 20,000 and 40,000 years ago, which means that by the time humans began farming, our partnership with dogs was already ancient. The wolves that stayed with us were no longer the wolves that stayed away. They had crossed an invisible line into something else, not quite human, not quite wild. By the late stage of this process, humans were no longer simply tolerating these animals, they were burying them. At Bonober Castle, as I've already mentioned, a dog was laid to rest with 2 humans, a shared grave filled with the evidence of care. Other burials from the Mesolithic show similar tenderness. Dogs adorned with red ochre, positioned beside their human companions as if ready to walk together into whatever lay beyond. These burials speak to a truth beyond survival. This was no longer just an alliance of convenience, it was a kinship, a recognition of individuality. Somewhere along the way, humans stopped thinking of these animals as wolves that don't bite, and began to think of them as our dogs. The shift is subtle but profound. The sleepless historian, staring into the glow of the lamp, can't help but wonder how much of ourselves was shaped by this bond. Did we become better hunters because we learned from them? Did we become more social because we cared for them? Did the act of sharing food with another species make us more capable of sharing with each other? And still, even after tens of thousands of years, if you listen on a cold night, you can hear the echo of the beginning. A cautious step into the firelight, the flare of eyes in the dark, and the quiet decision by both parties to stay. The Ice Age was a patient sculptor. For tens of thousands of years it carved the land into stark contrasts. Endless white expanses of snow-draped tundra, wind-swept steppes where nothing grew taller than the waist, forests that huddled like green islands in a frozen sea. In this environment, survival was a precise equation. Too much risk and you died, too little boldness and you starved. Both humans and wolves were masters of the equation, but they solved it in different ways. Humans were toolmakers. We bent stone, bone, and antler to our will, crafting weapons that extended the reach of our arms, spears that pierced from afar, blades that sliced through hide and tendon. Wolves were born weapons, muscle, teeth, and speed refined over millennia. We each held what the other lacked, but for a long time we used these gifts in competition, not cooperation. Somewhere in the deep cold, something began to shift. Perhaps it started with hunger, as so many evolutionary changes do. Imagine a winter where the great herds have moved beyond reach. A band of humans, tired, thin, low on meat, watch a pack of wolves take down a reindeer. The humans, desperate, wait until the wolves have eaten their fill, then move in to claim what's left. The wolves in turn learn that these strange upright creatures are dangerous in a fight, but useful in finding prey. This tentative truce may have been repeated hundreds of times over centuries, and in those repetitions patterns formed. Certain wolves, the ones less fearful of human presence, learned to follow at a distance, shadowing the hunters like living smoke. Certain humans learned that the howls of these wolves could serve as a signal. Prey is near, danger is moving, the night is not safe. It is here, in this subtle dance of parallel lives, that the ghost wolf enters the story, a now extinct lineage believed to be the common ancestor of modern dogs and modern wolves. Genetic studies have traced faint echoes of this ghost wolf in the DNA of living canines, a reminder that the animals at the beginning of our relationship are gone, replaced by their descendants who adapted to our shared life. This is one of evolution's quieter tragedies. The very creatures who began the partnership did not live to see its flowering. But their legacy is everywhere in the archaeological record. In sites scattered across Eurasia, bones tell a consistent story. Changes in skull shape, tooth size, and jaw strength appear long before full domestication. These were wolves being shaped, not by human hands, but by the invisible pressure of their new lifestyle. Eating cooked scraps instead of raw carcasses reduced the need for massive crushing jaws. Living near humans favoured those with lower stress responses, since skittish animals fled before they could eat. Over generations, these traits became encoded in the blood. And humans were changing too, though we didn't leave a skeleton to prove it. We left something else: art. Cave paintings and carved figurines from the Upper Paleolithic sometimes depict canid shapes alongside humans. It's not always clear if these are symbolic wolves, proto-dogs, or mythic creatures, but their very presence suggests a mental shift. These animals had entered not just our camps, but our imagination. The imagination is a powerful thing. Once a species enters it, the rules of the relationship change. A wolf at the fire's edge is a risk. A wolf in the mind is a story. And stories bind us more tightly than fear. We may have begun to see these canids not simply as animals, but as allies with spirits, as beings with roles in our own cosmic order. Many hunter-gatherer societies today still tell of wolves as guides, guardians, or kin, echoes, perhaps, of beliefs born in the Ice Age. Cooperation grew in small increments. Early human hunters may have noticed that certain wolves excelled at certain tasks. Some tracked by scent more reliably, others were more agile in chasing small game. Without formal breeding, humans may have begun to encourage the presence of the animals that fit their needs. A wolf that didn't steal too aggressively from the drying racks was allowed to stay. One that barked or howled when strangers approached became a valued sentinel. Over time, this unconscious selection began to shape behaviour as much as diet had shaped their jaws. The emotional connection would have been the final alchemy. We know from modern research that the bond between dogs and humans is reinforced by the same oxytocin feedback loop that strengthens parent-child relationships. When a dog looks into a human's eyes, oxytocin levels rise in both, a hormonal signal of trust and affection. It's almost certain that this loop didn't appear overnight. But as proto-dogs learned to seek our gaze and humans learned to respond, the chemical architecture of companionship was laid down. By 20,000 BCE, the line between wild and domestic was already blurry in some regions. Some canids still roamed the wild, avoiding humans entirely. Others had become camp followers, and still others, perhaps only a few, were firmly embedded within human groups, travelling with them, sharing kills, sleeping near the fires. In these animals, we see the early working dogs, not breeds as we know them, but specialists shaped by life. The ones good at scent tracking were prized on the hunt. The ones with fierce loyalty guarded the camp. The smaller, more agile ones may have helped control pests or flush game from hiding. This was not yet domestication as agriculture would bring. No kennels, no selective breeding on a large scale. But it was a domestication of the mind. The partnership had become habitual, expected, even relied upon. And from this foundation, the full transformation into the domestic dog was inevitable. If the Ice Age was a sculptor, then fire was the chisel. Around those shared flames, wolves became dogs and humans became something slightly less human, or perhaps more so. We learned that survival could mean trusting another species, that strength could come from shared senses and shared risks. By the time the great ice sheets began their slow retreat, around 15,000 years ago, the world was changing underfoot. Rivers cut new paths through the thawing earth, grasslands spread where glaciers had once ground the land to stone, and forests returned in waves, crowding the horizons with their green shadows. With these changes came new challenges and new opportunities, for both humans and the wolves that had begun to follow them. For tens of millennia, our relationship had been one of parallel lives. We hunted together at times, stole from each other at others, and shared the uncertain warmth of firelight in the deep winters. But as the Ice Age loosened its grip, something began to solidify in the minds of both species. We were no longer merely coexisting. We were, in a sense, becoming one another's fate. The archaeological record marks this moment with extraordinary tenderness. The Bonn-Oberkassel grave in modern Germany, dating to about 14,200 years ago, is one of the clearest. A man, a woman, and a young dog, not merely placed side by side, but arranged, their bodies oriented as if still bound by the intimacy of life. The dog's bones show signs of a severe illness that would have made it unable to hunt or fend for itself, and yet it lived long enough to heal. That means someone, perhaps both humans in the grave, fed it, protected it, and cared for it until the end. This is a detail worth pausing over. In a world where every scrap of meat was fought for, where survival meant ruthless efficiency, these people gave food to an animal that could not contribute to the hunt. That act tells us more about the depth of our bond than any genetic study ever could. This was no longer about utility. This was family. Other graves from the Mesolithic carry similar echoes. In northern Israel's Ain Malaha site, a woman is buried with her hand resting gently on the body of a puppy. In Siberia, at the Shaman Kaya site, dogs are interred alongside hunting tools, suggesting their role was not just physical, but symbolic, perhaps spiritual. The symbolic dimension of this partnership cannot be overstated. Once humans began seeing dogs not merely as animals, but as beings with a place in their cosmology, the relationship moved beyond biology. Dogs may have become clan totems, spiritual guides, even intermediaries between the living and the dead. It is possible, even likely, that the first domesticated dogs were not just workers, but participants in ritual life. In these early millennia, breeds, as we think of them, did not exist, but differences in form were emerging. Dogs in forested regions tended to be smaller, more agile, suited to maneuvering through dense vegetation. Dogs in open steppe regions were larger, built for endurance chases after swift prey. This was natural selection shaped indirectly by human lifestyle, not yet the deliberate, systematic breeding of the agricultural age. And still, the genes were changing. Studies of mitochondrial DNA show that the dog genome carries unique markers not found in modern wolves, confirming that the split was not a matter of simple taming. These were different animals, genetically distinct, the product of thousands of years of adaptation to human environments. One of the most fascinating examples is the black coat colour in North American wolves, which genetic analysis has traced back to early dogs. At some point, domesticated dogs interbred with wild wolves, passing along this mutation, a visible reminder of the genetic exchange between the two paths. But the most profound changes were in behaviour. Wolves, even when socialised from a young age, remain independent, wary, and prone to reverting to their instincts. Dogs, by contrast, had begun to see humans as their primary social partners. They sought our gaze, interpreted our gestures, and relied on our cues to make decisions. This level of cross-species communication was, and remains, unique in the animal kingdom. I often think about the first human who pointed at something and had a dog understand. Not follow the line of sight by accident, not stumble upon the meaning, but truly understand that the gesture was a signal. In that moment, something happened that had never occurred before in evolutionary history. Two species that had once competed for the same prey were now sharing not just food, but thought. By 12,000 BCE, dogs were part of human migration patterns, following us into every climate we entered. When we crossed into the Americas, they came with us, padding across the Bering Land Bridge alongside hunters wrapped in caribou hides. When we settled along rivers and lakes, they adapted to fishing life, scavenging near drying racks and warning of predators. In every new niche we found, they found one too. Their roles expanded. In addition to hunting partners and sentinels, they became load bearers, pulling small sleds or carrying packs. They helped herd game toward traps or drive them into natural enclosures. In the high latitudes, they became essential for travel across snow and ice, their bodies bred by nature and need for endurance in the cold. And still, around the firelight, there must have been the quieter moments. A dog's head resting on a human knee, a hunter absently scratching behind an ear while telling stories to the children. This intimacy, repeated millions of times over thousands of years, is the invisible thread that tied our histories together. It was not the kill that sealed our partnership, but the comfort of presence. The late Pleistocene world was a place of sharp contrasts. Danger and safety, scarcity and abundance, cold and warmth. But in the relationship between human and dog, there was a rare constancy. Each could read the other's signals, each could predict the other's needs. It is no wonder that when humans began to settle, plant crops and build permanent homes, the dog was the first animal to make the transition with us. And as the glaciers melted into memory, the wolf that had once stood at the edge of the fire was gone. In its place was the dog, not an invention, not a conquest, but the result of a long unspoken agreement between two species who had learned, against the odds, to trust. The dawn of the Holocene was the dawn of a new pace of life. The ice was in retreat, the great herds shifted their migration routes, and humans, for the first time in our long story, began to settle. Along fertile river valleys and sheltered coastal plains, camps became villages, and villages became something that felt dangerously close to permanence. With this change came new challenges and new rhythms, and the dogs that had once roamed alongside nomadic hunters faced an evolution of purpose. For thousands of years their work had been measured in the chase, the rush of the hunt, the long pursuit, the decisive moment when prey fell. Now, in these early settlements, their value extended into the quiet hours. They guarded grain stores from scavengers. They patrolled the perimeters of newly planted fields. They barked at strangers long before a human watchman could stir from his mat. In these places where humans had gathered not just for the season, but for the cycle of the sun and back again, a dog was not simply a hunting partner. It was a guardian of place. The archaeological remains from sites like Sayonu in southeastern Anatolia and Jiahu in China show early agricultural communities where dog bones appear not on the fringes, but within the heart of the settlement. The placement suggests that they were no longer only tolerated, they were integrated. Dogs lived within the human space, shared its rhythms, and in some cases its food stores. The dogs themselves were changing. The constant presence of humans and their livestock shaped not just behaviour but physiology. Some became smaller, more agile, better suited to darting between structures or chasing vermin through narrow spaces. Others grew larger and more imposing, their very size a deterrent to predators and thieves. Without conscious planning, early farmers were already influencing the genetic direction of their canine companions. It's tempting to imagine that this was the beginning of deliberate breeding, but in truth, intentional selection came slowly. The concept of breeds, as we understand them today, animals selected for appearance or specialized traits, was still far in the future. Instead, the shaping hand of humanity in this era was more subtle. The farmer who kept the litter from the best herder, the fisherman who favoured the pup that was quick to learn, the herdsman who shared scraps with the dog that stood its ground against a prowling cat. Over generations, such choices nudged populations toward specific aptitudes. One of the earliest and most transformative roles for dogs in settled life was herding. As humans domesticated goats, sheep, and cattle, the need to control and protect these animals was immediate. Dogs, with their predatory instincts tempered by thousands of years in human company, were uniquely suited for the task. The same behaviours that once drove prey toward a waiting spear could now be directed toward guiding flocks. The skill was not purely instinctive, it was shaped by human teaching, the call of the voice, the whistle, the gesture. In learning to herd, dogs deepened their fluency in the shared language between our species. In the wetlands and river deltas, dogs became fishers' assistants, startling waterfowl into nets or retrieving fish caught in shallow traps. In forested regions, they tracked and flushed small game for the pot. In harsher climates, they carried loads, turning their endurance into transport for goods and tools. Even the pups that were too small, too slow, or too timid found a role, as companions for children, warmth against the cold, or, in the most practical terms, a living alarm system. The symbolic dimension of dogs in early agricultural societies also deepened. In burial sites from the Fertile Crescent to the shores of the Baltic, dogs appear in positions of honour, sometimes laid beside their human partners, sometimes with offerings as if provisioned for a journey beyond life. In some cases they appear in iconography as protectors, standing between the human figure and the dangers of the wild. The dog was no longer just an animal of utility, it was an animal of meaning. And here, a subtle but profound shift occurred. Dogs began to inherit not only our environments but our stories. In early mythologies, they became guardians of thresholds, between home and wilderness, between life and death. They were watchful companions of deities, hunters alongside gods, escorts of souls into the afterlife. This elevation in cultural imagination was not accidental. It was born of millennia of shared work and mutual reliance. By now, the genetic distance between dog and wolf was unmistakable. The early Holocene dogs were, in every way that mattered, their own species. They could still interbreed with wolves, and in some regions did, but their behaviour, physical traits, and even their reproductive patterns had shifted under the weight of human proximity. They came into heat more frequently than wolves, a change that allowed humans to shape generations more quickly. Their dietary tolerance had broadened, enabling them to digest more starch, an adaptation tied directly to scavenging from human agriculture. And yet, despite all this change, the wolf's shadow lingered in their bodies and minds, in the tilt of the head at a distant sound, in the sudden stillness before a pounce, in the curled rest of the sleeping form. The old instincts lived on. Dogs were no longer wolves, but they carried the memory of the hunt, the shared cold, the first fire. The early Holocene was an age of beginnings, of farming, of permanent dwellings, of new social orders. But for the dog, it was also an age of deepening. The relationship that had been born in the frozen breath of the Ice Age had now rooted itself into the daily life of humanity. No longer just fellow travellers, we were co-architects of each other's futures. The dog was part of the human story in every village, on every path, in every household. And so the two species that had once met as rivals on the open steppe now awoke each morning to the same sun, walked the same paths, and lay down under the same roof. The transformation was complete in form, but in spirit the journey was still unfolding. For as long as humans and dogs shared the same horizon, their story would never truly end. As human societies expanded and specialized, so too did their dogs. Trade routes spread across continents, carrying not just goods, but living companions. A herding dog from the grassy plains of Central Asia might find itself in a river valley town, adapting to guard granaries instead of guiding sheep. Dogs became part of the economy, their skills as transport animals, hunters and protectors, as valuable as any crafted tool. In warfare, they marched beside soldiers, bearing messages, startling enemy horses and even fighting when needed. In religion they appeared in carvings, myths and rituals, guardians of sacred spaces, companions to gods, guides for souls in the afterlife. Each culture bent the dog's form and role toward its own needs, and through selective keeping and breeding, physical variety flourished. Lean sighthounds in open deserts, stocky guardians in mountain villages, swift-footed trackers in dense forests. By now, breeding was deliberate. Farmers selected for strong herding instinct, hunters for sharp scent, nobles for beauty or status. The wolf was still in their blood, but the dog's destiny was entirely human-shaped, and in every camp, village and city, the quiet bond remained. The shared gaze across the firelight, the ancient trust that had begun in the Ice Age and endured through every change in the world around them. The growth of agriculture, trade and settlement meant that dogs were no longer merely companions of hunters, but became essential members of complex human communities. In the river cities of Mesopotamia, they trotted through narrow streets alongside merchants, their eyes and noses alert to both threat and opportunity. In the far north, they ran in teams across the ice, their paws leaving a chain of prints that marked the lifeline between scattered settlements. As human civilizations grew more interconnected, dogs travelled farther than any other domesticated animal. Merchant caravans brought them across mountains and deserts, often as guardians for the very goods being traded. In port cities, sailors brought dogs aboard ships, using them to control vermin or to stand watch during long nights at sea. Wherever they went, they carried with them the genetic and behavioural legacies of their homelands, blending traits in ways that would shape future lineages. In some cultures, dogs were elevated beyond the role of helper and entered the realm of the sacred. In ancient Egypt, depictions of jackal-headed deities suggest a reverence for canines, that blurred the line between myth and memory. In Mesoamerica, the Xoloitzcuintli was believed to guide souls to the underworld, a role echoing the ancient burials of the Ice Age. These beliefs ensured that dogs were protected and cherished, even as other animals were kept purely for labour or food. Selective breeding, though not yet bound by the rigid standards of modern kennel clubs, began to focus on more distinct purposes. The lithe and long-legged sighthounds of the Middle East were bred for speed and vision, their task to spot and chase game across open desert. Mastiff-like dogs in Asia and Europe grew large and strong, standing guard over flocks and homes. The compact, quick-footed dogs of forested lands excelled in flushing and tracking, their keen noses leading hunters to game. In many regions, a dog's role determined its status in the human social order. A skilled herder might be as valued as a prized bull. A hunting hound might be a gift worthy of kings. With status came protection and sometimes ornamentation. Collars of leather, bronze, or carved bone appear in the archaeological record, a clear sign that these animals were not anonymous beasts but individuals with identities, perhaps even names. Warfare, too, drew on canine strength. Dogs accompanied armies, sometimes wearing armour of their own, used to break enemy lines, guard camps, or carry messages through dangerous territory. In the chaos of battle, their loyalty was a steadying force, and stories of war dogs who refused to leave their fallen masters echo across cultures. Such tales, whether literal or mythic, reinforced the image of the dog as an embodiment of courage and devotion. But even amid the utilitarian demands of agriculture, hunting, trade, and war, the private bond between human and dog deepened. In every era, there are hints of companionship for companionship's sake. The farmer resting a hand on a dog's head at the end of the day, the child laughing as a pup chases the dust motes in a sunlit courtyard. These moments, small and countless, shaped the emotional foundation of a relationship that was as much about comfort as necessity. In art, dogs began to appear not just as symbols or functional figures, but as portraits, captured with affection and detail. Cave walls, temple friezes, and later painted scrolls show dogs in mid-run, at rest, or curled beside human figures. Such depictions are more than records of appearance. They are records of feeling, evidence that humans saw dogs as beings worth remembering in their own right. By the late Holocene, the dog was truly global. From Arctic sled dogs to Polynesian village guardians, from Saharan coursers to Andean herders, they had adapted to every environment their human partners occupied. Each adaptation was a conversation between environment, human need, and the ancient instincts carried from their wolf ancestors. Yet no matter the role or the shape, every dog shared the same essential bond with humanity: the willingness to work beside us, live among us, and in many cases die for us. The story that had begun in the cold breath of the Pleistocene now spanned climates, continents, and cultures. The wolf who had once lingered at the edge of the fire had transformed into an animal who slept in our homes, guarded our children, and followed us into the unknown. And though the world had changed beyond recognition, the quiet exchange that began tens of thousands of years ago still played out every day. In a shared glance, a wagging tail, and the simple choice to stay by each other's side. In the heart of bustling marketplaces, dogs learned the art of navigating human crowds, slipping between carts and stalls as easily as they once wove through underbrush. They became the quiet observers of human life, witnessing the exchanges of goods, the laughter, the quarrels, and the quiet moments of rest. In their own way, they were archivists of our daily existence, storing in their senses the scents, sounds, and rhythms of each settlement they called home. In colder climates, the partnership took on a survivalist edge. Sled dogs were not just transportation, but lifelines, moving food, firewood, and people across frozen expanses where no cart or beast of burden could travel. Their endurance was legendary, and their capacity for work in harsh conditions became a source of pride and identity for the human communities that depended on them. In coastal societies, dogs adapted to the rhythms of tide and wind. Fishermen taught them to retrieve nets from the shallows, to bark when schools of fish approached, even to guard boats pulled onto the sand. Such dogs were as much a part of maritime life as the boats themselves, their paws tracing the same shorelines for generations. Across all these roles, one truth endured: the dog's loyalty was not bound by geography or task. Whether herding sheep in the highlands, guarding a gate in a walled city, or sleeping beside a traveller on the open road, the bond remained constant. That bond did not require words, for it was built on the deep, unspoken understanding that had been growing since the first wolf dared to step close to the fire. And so, by the close of the Holocene's earliest chapters, the dog had become more than a domesticated animal. It was a reflection of humanity itself, adaptable, resilient, and shaped by the shared story of survival. Each generation of dogs carried in its eyes the memory of its wild ancestors, and in its heart the quiet promise that it would walk beside us into whatever future we faced. And now, here we are, thousands of years and countless paw prints from that first shared firelight. The wolf's sharp gaze has softened into the dog's warm eyes, yet somewhere deep within, the old instincts remain, stitched into muscle and memory. They remember the long hunt, the cold wind, the flicker of flame against the night. We remember too, though perhaps not in words, in the way we feel safer when they lie beside us, in the way their joy lifts ours without asking for anything but our company. The story of dogs is not a tale we told and finished. It is a conversation still in motion, one that began before our ancestors could write, and one that will continue long after our own footsteps fade. Every bark that greets us at the door, every silent walk through the dusk, every shared glance across the room is another line in a story older than history itself. It is easy to think of domestication as something we did to them, that we shaped the wolf into the dog, but look closely and you will see the truth. They shaped us as well. They taught us loyalty, vigilance, and joy in the simplest moments. They taught us that strength can walk beside gentleness, and that companionship can be as vital as bread or fire. From the frozen steppes of 30,000 BCE to the quiet streets of today, dogs have been there, not just surviving with us, but helping us become more than we were. They have followed us into deserts, forests, mountains, and seas, each time adapting, each time remaining steadfast. In return, we have made them part of our families, our myths, and our very sense of home. So here's to them, the quiet hunters turned guardians, the herders, the companions, the friends. May we always walk together, as we have for so long, and may the road ahead be as kind to them as they have been to us. Until next time, my friends, walk gently, live fully, and keep your fire burning bright.